evening and welcome to the Shelburne Planning Commission meeting of May 11th, 2017. First item on our agenda is approval of the agenda. I will consider a motion to approve.
So moved.
Second the motion?
Moved by Kate, seconded by Ann. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Next item on our agenda is approval of the minutes for April 27th, 2017, a copy of which is in your packet. Consider a motion to approve.
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Dick, seconded by Jason. Any discussion, comments? I have none. Everybody good with them?
I have one question.
Okay, Dick?
Page 4, second bullet, last line, says agriculture goes beyond farming and is to ensure uses that are not agriculture do not locate in the rural district. Is that intended to say do not?
Which point, which bullet point?
The
Second.
second
Second
bullet,
bullet.
the last sentence, agriculture goes beyond farming and is to ensure uses that are not agriculture
No, that's
do not locate in the rural district. Was that correct?
That's not really what it should say.
It's not something I said.
It's really not going beyond farming. That's not the idea, right?
Right, integrated agriculture, I'm just trying to keep it short and sweet. I'm not sure that the sentence is necessary, is one way to address it. If people feel that it's important.
I don't feel it.
Anybody want to keep it in or okay deleting?
Let's
All
delete
right,
it.
we don't want the public to be confused, so we'll go ahead and delete it. Anything else, Dick? Okay. I was not there, so I'm going to abstain, but all in favor?
Aye.
One abstention. Minutes are approved. Next item on our agenda is disclosures relating to any potential conflicts of interest with respect to any agenda items. Any hands, voices? Seeing no conflicts, we'll move on to the next item, which is open to the public. And this is an opportunity for non-agenda related comments from any of our friends in the audience. Seeing no hands, we'll move on. Oh, please.
Look up.
I'm going too fast here. Please, grab the mic. And your name, please.
My name is Linda Lavalette. I live on Bay Road. And myself and our neighbors on Bay Road have gone through quite a year-plus-long exercise talking about the Bay Road corridor. And I will admit, myself personally, I have not paid attention to the town plan. I left it in your capable hands and all the other volunteer committee members that we have in the town. But when a community, when a neighborhood is so severely stressed by a town proposal and has to go to meetings for over a year, and every time we say anything, we're told, but it's in the town plan, look at the town plan, then I would like to make some points and some suggestions. I've since read it, at least those that pertained to the bike path and travel and recreation and all that. And I'm going to make some points that I made in front of the select board a couple of times, that nobody wants to see anyone hurt. Pedestrian, vehicle, bicyclist, nobody. Safety is important. But there are multiple means to get to an end, and the plans that were presented were massive, in the words I think Kate came up with. And we kept saying, gee, you know, there's alternatives. We could do it this way, we could do it that way. And I understand funding, and I understand a lot more than I did a year ago. But one of the things that I think is lacking that you could help us address in the town plan, couple of things. When committees, specifically the Bike and Pedestrian Path Committee, is making plans for modifying the road to include path or modifying properties to include paths, that the very first thing that should be done by that or any other committee talking about modifying neighborhoods or properties is to do what the select board did in the last year, which was to mail out postcards to adjacent property owners warning them, hey, this discussion is being held by the town, please come and participate. Had that taken place at the bike and pedestrian path meetings, whenever the Bay Road corridor thing was first had come about since 2004 when it got voted down, then there would have been more public participation. The residents and the people most affected by changes from this committee, even towards good goals, we could have worked out and ironed out some things and come up with much better proposals that wouldn't have been voted down for whatever reasons after going through scoping studies and things like that. So I think that any town board should communicate to the population for those people most affected by their potential plans. I would like to see the town plan actually address this. Now, I'm specifically talking right now about bike and pedestrian paths, but I'm sure you all have areas much grander than just that, where you deal with properties such as, the Route 7 corridor. But if people were notified to come and participate at the beginning, then we wouldn't feel like, geez, it's nearly decided and where have we been. And I think the town plan, I've read what it said. It talks about new developments. And new developments are fine because nobody's got a house there yet. So planning for wider access or bike paths or walking paths or multi-use in a new development, perfect, go for it. The people that buy those properties will know where it is. They'll build their houses away from them. But on older streets and roads and neighborhoods such as Bay Road, especially Bay Road, with all the things that we have, narrow streets, houses very close to the road, tight neighborhoods, parking basically just off the road, that the extravagant and wonderful ideas shouldn't be forced on the older streets and neighborhoods. You can't make some things fit, the 5-pound into a 2-pound rule. And I think the town plan should have wording to that degree that the older neighborhoods, the older roads, when they're looked at to be retrofitted with these modifications, number one, get the property owners in it right at the beginning. Number two, put some safeguard in the town plan for the existing roads and neighborhoods so that they're not facing a 16-foot swath, even though it might be the right of way. My mom used to tell me, even though you have the right to do something, it's not necessarily the right thing to do. And that's basically what boiled down with the plans and Bay Road. Bay Road wasn't suited, and we're very happy that the select board had their reasons for rejecting the plan. Bay Road is willing, and we've got our own ideas, but it didn't seem like anybody listened. So, could the town plan address such issues as making some sort of wording for coming up when bike paths, multi-use paths, bike lanes, all these things that affect properties, because even though it's a town road, town right away, everybody gets that. We pay for the property and own the property up to the marker. The town has a right of way, we get that. But when the older neighborhoods and roads are looked at, I think the town plan should have some wording that protects, that can limit the extent of the changes, or a certain percentage of the property owners affected are in agreement. Because we found one person on Bay Road that wanted that, but he moved there 2 months ago, and it's the old move and change. You move someplace, you change it to make the way you think it's comfortable, then you move and leave whatever you changed, for those of us that have lived there our whole lives. So is that possible?
Linda, thank you. Good comments. Your timing's very good, I will say, as far as this topic, since it's not a warned item. We won't respond substantively, but we're
Because
all
I have
ears
other
here. and
ideas.
I'm sure you do.
I'm
that
willing to work with you
what I-
guys.
And we will with you. What I
And you
wanted
just
to
let me
tell
know how I
you,
can
is
contribute and be a part.
so we are, timing-wise, you're in a good spot if you're looking to provide input. And as a commission, we're absolutely trying to get as much community input as we can into this rewrite. So stay tuned on dates for when you're going to see specific sections of the plan itself being discussed. At which point, we would love to have you in every session. We'd love to have your neighbors in every session to talk about how can we make improvements or fine-tune issues that may not be working for
Okay.
a
As
particular community.
Sidebar, could we send you or someone a list of names, emails, phone numbers to be contacted when meetings are, I mean, I know you're twice a month, but you don't always talk about this, and, I mean, I don't know. Maybe I should just come twice a month.
I'll let Dean respond as far as how the audience goes for particular topics of
Linda, if you'd like
invites.
to.
Yeah, I can't really respond to
Yeah,
that.
I mean, if you want to supply an email list that expands the list of people that get the agendas for the planning commission meetings, by all means.
Would that be helpful?
And who should I give it to?
You can
Dean.
email it to me or to Susan Canizaro.
Okay, that'll be a good start.
Okay. Do you get the impression your counterparts and colleagues aren't seeing the notifications in the Shelburne News or in the Front Porch Forum? Or how can we think about, you don't need to answer now, but how can we be more effective with our outreach, especially on a topic like this that will generate,
I have
hopefully.
lots of ideas, and you
Okay,
don't have the
so
time
let's-
tonight, so we'll, to be continued.
Great. Thank you for your input, Linda. Any other public comments this evening? Now seeing no hands, we'll move on to the headline for this evening, which is our community meeting on form-based zoning 2.0, we're calling it. So we're fortunate to have with us this evening PlaceSense, which is our consulting team, led by Brandy Saxton. And I will let you introduce your colleagues who are in the audience. We also have with us tonight Lee Crone from the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission. We're fortunate as a town to have Lee here. Everybody should recognize that. We're also fortunate to have the Regional Planning Commission support on this project. We've spent, as a commission, just for background and context, we have a existing form-based code in the Route 7 North Corridor. We'll get into more detail on where this is and what it looks like. That was adopted by the Select Board about a year ago, I want to say May 2016. I might have the date wrong, Dean?
Yep.
So what that did is essentially add a separate path for land development. We have current zoning, and there's this new form-based code zoning, which we're going to talk about what that is and give everyone a flavor for it. But for context, that was about a year ago. Since then, we've worked on this exercise of how do we iterate on knowing that the current code has some issues where we needed to fine-tune. I think the entire commission recognized that there are opportunities to improve this. So as PlaceSense has been helping us identify, we identified 5 or 6 areas, which we'll learn more about tonight, as our priorities during the scoping process. And over the past few months, we've worked on the initial pieces of that engagement. And tonight is what we're calling the community forum, to really have everybody sit down, talk about input. We have a couple workshops that we'll be able to work through, and interested in everybody's feedback. So please be vocal. Thank you for coming out. And I will hand the mic over to Brandy to walk us through our forum here.
I can adjust the lights for the.
Yeah, if you could get the front ones down at least, that would be nice. So, should I have this mic in my hand? Okay, it seems to be humming. Okay, so I'm Brandy Saxton. Going to put the mic way down low and speak softly, I guess. I'm working with Shelburne on the form-based code since late last fall, early winter time. So we've into this a few months. We've got an initial run through and draft of proposed changes. We've identified a few priority issues and are going to be focusing on those tonight. With me tonight is Amy McCrellis from Stone Environmental. She's a real stormwater guru, and since stormwater is one of our major areas of concern and priority here, so we're really happy to have Amy here to answer the difficult technical questions. Okay. So we've already got a little bit of the project background going. I'm going to give a brief overview, and Amy will chime in as necessary here on the overview of what we're going to be going through tonight. And then we're going to break out into, I think, given our numbers, 2 small groups to focus in on some of those topics in greater detail. So we already covered that the form-based code was adopted last year, and we really began this effort to refine this in January. The town adopted it knowing that there were still a few loose ends that needed to be followed up on, so we've been building in some of that, and that, as the code has been in place for a year, it's given time to look at it, see the first application or 2 come through, and get some sense of what might be needed to refine it and improve upon it. So we are supposed to be looking at trying to raise awareness of the form-based overlay district and the opportunities that it creates, looking at promoting pedestrian-friendly and transit-oriented development in the Route 7 corridor that's covered by this, looking at the provisions in the language that relate to infill development. This recognizes that most of the land in the corridor is already developed, and so the form-based code would be looking at redevelopment of previously developed sites and just making sure that it's clear how that can occur, whether it's a complete sort of rehab, revision of what's there, you tear it down and start over with something different, or it's just adding to what's there, or other types of remodeling of what's there, or changes in use and such. So we're going to be looking at that piece. We're not going to focus on that too much tonight, but that's one piece we are looking at. Adding building material standards. This was something that was sort of left as a placeholder in the current adopted code, and we'll be coming back around to talking about that. We're going to be looking at that tonight and thinking about how to encourage development that creates a sense of place. That's not necessarily something we're focusing on a lot tonight either, but is one of the things that the whole project is looking at. And our goal is to have this revision completed by basically the end of the summer, a new draft, and then the town will be ready to go through that adoption process again to update it. So I'm going to jump into the first of the issues that we're going to talk about in more detail tonight, and it's around building height and sort of the occupancy of upper floor space, whether the goal of the code is to, in some places, require multi-story buildings. Is it to require buildings that appear to be multi-story but don't necessarily have functional upper story space, things of that nature. So we were really looking to try to resolve some internal inconsistencies and complexities that are in the existing document. So there's several places where height is discussed and regulated in the code, and there's those pieces don't necessarily fit that great together. So we're trying to clarify and figure out what exactly the vision is for buildings and building heights, and so we can clarify that code and make sure it's doing what you want it to do. And so these examples, do you think the other one's better?
I was just going to get this one away.
Okay, see if that's what's causing the humming. So these 2 examples here, the visual examples, the one at the top, it's a little hard to see in the light, but it's actually, I've got a printout of it over on the table so you can see it, is a Dunkin' Donuts. That fairly recently built Dunkin' Donuts, actually. That's actually a functional 2-story building. It does have a second floor. So that's interesting. And this one you probably have seen and perhaps been in. It's your South Burlington Trader Joe's. Appears to have a second floor, does not actually. If you've been inside, you'll notice no second floor. However, it's sitting, of course, next to that Pier 1, which does have the functional second floor, essentially the same height and size of this building. So from the street, the 2 buildings appear fairly similar. Inside, the space is functionally different. So, there's several elements of the current code that are talking about height. There's the character districts, which are the different segments along the corridor. They talk about what types and heights of buildings are needed. There is a written narrative in both charts and tables about that, so there's a lot of places where this is mentioned, and then there are specific types of buildings and the heights that those types of buildings can be. So all these pieces need to be working together. So the various character districts, and we'll look at these when we get to this in greater detail, but we have actually the regulating plan up here. And so the different colored areas are the different character districts along the corridor. So if you think this is the South Burlington line coming down to the south, so each colored area is one of those character districts. So the some of the character districts have a 1.5 story minimum height requirement. The red areas on these maps at the intersections, those areas have a 1.5 story minimum height, and then certain types of buildings have height requirements. So detached dwellings and live-work unit type buildings have to be at least 1.5 stories, whereas townhouses and mixed-use storefronts have to be at least 2 stories. So all these elements in the code relate to building height. Just in terms of the photo examples here, these are sort of sloped roof. They're essentially single-story buildings, but with pitched roofs so that they have the sort of massing and give the impression of being, maybe 1.5 stories. The one thing the code is not entirely clear on is whether when it does require that second story, does it have to be habitable functional space? When it says that there needs to be a 1/2 story, it is clear that that does not have to be habitable space. And then there's the question around different types of uses. Depending on what types of uses you think are appropriate in these areas, some types of uses are more likely to want to locate in a multi-story building than others. One of our other team members can't be here tonight, but Paul Simon, who has some experience working from a development perspective, actually was part of the project team working on the Trader Joe's, had some pretty good examples of projects that he's worked on that certain types of businesses, like he had an example of a healthcare provider in Chittenden County was looking for space. They simply weren't considering a building that had a second floor for several reasons of in terms of access and how they use the space. It just wouldn't have worked for them, and because of the if you were in downtown Manhattan, they wouldn't go into a single-story building and you'd still have the use. But given the fact that there's plenty of spaces to choose from, they could say that that's what they wanted and find it. So that is a question to think about, too, in terms of what the uses are going to be that would go into the multi-story building versus a single-story building. And then there's just simply some building owners don't want to have to deal with tenants in the upper floor. So if they're not going to fully occupy the building, they may not want to have renting space upstairs as well. So a lot of interesting elements come together when you think about that aspect of how the buildings will be owned and used. So the photo examples here again, this is an example once again with a pitched roof building that so built into a bit of a slope. So on one side it's going to appear as a 1-story building and on the other as a 2, functionally having 2 floors on that taller side, and then a building that's simply got the gables put on there and the little trim to make it appear to be more of a functional 1.5 stories, but in fact there's no usable space up there at all. So really, if we get down to the core of it, what we want to talk about tonight and get some sense of, is the goal the function of the 2-story, multi-story building, or is it the appearance? So we have yet another commercial example here with buildings that are designed to appear to have an upper floor space, but functionally don't really use that space. So that's building height. So the other aspect that has come up in our work, it wasn't quite on our original horizon as something we were going to be addressing, but has come up as an important issue as we've started to look at the code, is the issue of the proposed parallel streets. So this regulating plan shows on it areas here with blue, 2 of them, those blue dashed lines. That's a proposed new road in each case, paralleling essentially Route 7. So you're not gonna be able to see it on this one, but we do have a big map out there that you can see where that actually falls. So if you were to take that blue line and put it over the air photo and sort of think of it as being a 50-foot right-of-way that would allow for the creation of a road going across these lots. Like I said before, these lots are already developed. There's stuff there. So how to fit this road in and around what's already there is one of the questions. So if we just look at the very northern edge so we're basically looking at these lots right up here, these 3 or 4. So for those of you who orient by the places, so that's where the Thai restaurant is, the North Star Motel, Ethan Allen Plaza there. This is not a very big piece of land when you actually think about it. It's in 4 lots. It's roughly 600 feet of Route 7 frontage. These lots are not that much more than 300 feet deep. So if you think about trying to put a road in behind them, so you're basically taking that 300 feet of depth and taking 50 feet out of it, where is that road going to go? If it goes along the very back, it's close up to the neighborhood that's behind it. If you bring it down in, you've broken this lot up into 2 pieces that are not going to be big enough to really put buildings and parking effectively on because of the fairly shallow depth of the lots. So if you were starting all over from scratch, and all of them, and you were just going to redesign it, you might do that. You might put a road back there, put all the access off of it, not have any access off of Route 7, bring those buildings all the way up to the Route 7 sidewalk edge, and that would work. But when you have to fit it in and around, it becomes more challenging what's already there. There certainly are opportunities to do something a little bit less than the parallel street, which would be to start interconnecting the parking lots between lots. And that eventually over time would probably lead to the ability to close off some of the access points along Route 7 on some of the smaller lots, as people will be able to get in and out in between properties. So that's another option to think about. So as we think about the parallel street and the benefits of it, it certainly does reduce those access and conflict points on Route 7 and improve the overall traffic flow. So it's a way to accommodate increased traffic on these lots without necessarily increasing congestion on Route 7. It's consistent with and helps with that idea of bringing the development up to the road, to the Route 7 corridor, and putting the parking and access to the back. So it creates space from that. And the other piece that goes along with that is that there is a bike pedestrian path that goes along with the proposed road. And so pushing that back from Route 7 certainly has some benefits in terms of getting a much more walker and biker friendly place to be instead of right along the edge of Route 7. And it would also, the pathway would butt up to the neighborhoods, which would be convenient for the people who live by there too. The challenges, I think I've hit on a couple of these. There's a lot of lot area required, and it's not a cheap element to add a new road into the back of these properties. The lots aren't very deep. You can't really make a double frontage, so that means that the cost of the road can't be split amongst the 2 lots. Essentially, the cost of the road is 100% on each individual lot. And, it would really require a significant amount of redevelopment along a large section of this to come together in any meaningful way. There's a lot of things in the way, basically, existing buildings, existing parking, that would have to over time be relocated, redeveloped, moved around in order to make this happen. And it does reduce that buffer between the commercial lots and the neighborhoods behind on some of these lots, not on all of them, but particularly on the more shallow ones. So as we think about that, we have a big map of that out back, and we're just looking at that and sort of thinking, what do people want to do about that? Because as the code is written now, the lines are on the map, the text basically says that there's supposed to be a road back there. We need to sort of figure out what the intent is to provide those interconnections. Is the road the most effective way? What do people think about it? So that's the reason we're bringing that one up tonight. And then Amy, you want to take the...
Yes.
So on the stormwater front, in a portion of the town of Shelburne, you already have some stormwater management regulations in place. And we were talking about this a little bit back before the meeting for the Monroe Brook watershed, where the over time incremental development of subdivisions and commercial areas has now in modern times resulted in a stream that has flows that are way too high when it rains and too low during a dry period. So the town has already begun to respond to that. What happens with this overlay district is they've included the regulations that were already in place for that watershed, which actually is a lot of the overlay district is in that watershed already. So they've expanded the stormwater rules, the local stormwater rules, a little bit to cover this whole overlay district. And what that means is that where properties are undergoing redevelopment or new development, and there's going to be more than half an acre of impervious, the developer applicant is going to need to put some measures in place to control their stormwater runoff. At the state level, we're also shifting from just building ponds and using that for our stormwater management to trying to sink more water into the ground using vegetated practices wherever we can. There's going to be a new stormwater manual in July that is going to make that sort of the new law of the land for stormwater management when across the state when there's more than an acre of impervious cover being developed at a time. You guys already have it for half an acre, and there's portions of the stormwater regulations locally already that go in at half acre instead of an acre. So you're a little bit ahead of the curve even of the state in that regard. What I mean when I'm talking about sinking water into the ground is really shifting from those pond-related practices that you may see in some of our older developments along the Route 7 corridor into more vegetated practices like what we're seeing up here is a couple of options for parking lots where instead of there being catch basins, there are these sort of vegetated swales going along the edges of the parking lots or in parking islands where the water runs in there when it rains instead of just falling into a catch basin and going to a pond, or in some cases just going down a storm line into an outfall without any treatment. There are definitely some benefits of doing it this way, not just green space sort of habitat benefits, but also getting cleaner water out the other end of the pipe. There are some other things that you can do during development, narrowing streets, minimizing the amount of parking that's provided during a development or redevelopment project, just creating less impervious surface in the first place if you can do that without endangering safety or the convenience of your traveling public. One other thing that we're considering in this rewrite is ways to try to encourage neighbors to develop shared infrastructure where the soils in particular are suitable. And I know we had a little bit of conversation about there are some places in this overlay district where that could be done and some places where it's probably not going to be as easy just because of the soil conditions and shallow groundwater and bedrock limitations. I think I've nattered on long enough about that. Here's just a couple of examples again for parking areas in particular where you could have water flowing off a parking lot into a vegetated practice and maybe overflowing into a more natural area to soak in instead of ponding up and then being discharged into a stream. Another example for a parking lot where water comes in through a curb cut, and this is nice in some ways, in particular for maintenance, because you're maintaining a curb line so your plow guy isn't pushing everything into your practice. But you still have ways for the water to get in and filter through and potentially go out having gotten some treatment. These are, again, examples of kind of the streetscape and different ways that this could work. This one I particularly enjoy because there's kind of room for everyone in this. There's room for the cars, there's room for pedestrians and cyclists, there's some nice green space, And maybe most importantly, from my little stormwater geeky corner of the world, there's enough room here for both trees and filtering and stormwater management practices to happen. A lot of times we end up with tree lawns that are 3 feet wide or 5 feet wide, and it's very challenging to fit a healthy tree, let alone a little bit of slope down to a treatment practice that can be green and soak some water into the ground. This is an example of how that might work in a more dense neighborhood environment, like some of these, I'm gonna use my laser pointer on the, some of these intersections that we're talking about that have, in sort of the grand vision, perhaps some more closely clustered buildings that are also closer to the street. So you're piling a lot of different asks onto that relatively small part of an intersection in a neighborhood. And this is one example of a way that that could work and be pretty functional, still supporting trees and green infrastructure, supporting the foot traveling public and maybe the bike traveling public, and also supporting the roadway and the safety of that traveling public. These are all, there are some very nice benefits that you can get from that in terms of maintaining and improving water quality, reducing localized flooding eventually, especially during those sort of gully washer quick duration events. There are some challenges too, though, and I look forward to discussing them with whoever chooses to sit at my table back there in a little bit, in terms of limitations of soil and shallow groundwater, potential maintenance requirements, both for property owners and perhaps for the town, depending on where this infrastructure is located. Sometimes people have a hard time maintaining green infrastructure because it's a little different from what they're used to maintaining in terms of, you know how to vacuum out a catch basin if you're a public works guy, but this green stuff, it's a little weird. It takes a shift in thinking for some of us. There are some, depending on the materials that you're using, their longevity can cause some concern. We're still struggling to get permeable pavements right in Vermont. I think we'll get there, but you would want to be careful if you were a developer with an application and you were concerned about cost and the longevity of your infrastructure. And like I said, there are some things, both with gray, normal, everyday infrastructure and with this newer green stuff, we don't necessarily have it all figured out. There's still research going on and changes being made in terms of improving the long-term performance of all these kinds of measures. And I think I did just do it to myself. I talked about benefits and challenges on the same slide, which is not what I was going to do. But we'll stop here for a minute. This is another shot of your South Burlington Trader Joe's, and this is actually in the parking lot. So the next time you're up there, check it out. It's a good example of how this green infrastructure stuff can actually work in practice. I think that's actually all I had to say.
So the final piece that we're going to look at tonight is the building materials pieces. This is new language that we are putting together to put into the overlay district. The general idea that we're working from is that the Planning Commission would like to see, and this follows the town policies, quality buildings built here that are going to be long-lasting and going to be architecturally interesting, not necessarily can be found anywhere USA type buildings, something that speaks to the character of the community. Also, of being flexible in terms of not trying to recreate every building, that makes sure it looks like it was built in 1862 or something, we want diversity of the types of buildings, contemporary buildings, things like that as well. So trying to come up with a way to work through the building materials that will help provide some guidance as to what the town would be looking for and what would meet those goals. So what we've got going for proposal that we're looking for feedback on right now is a list of primary building materials, and the idea would be that at least 2/3 of the facade of a building would be made up of one or more of these primary building materials: brick, stone, wood, And then architectural concrete panels textured to simulate brick or stone. And please don't ask me about those because Paul's not here to explain it. Assumably, they will look like brick or stone when you look at them. So those would be what the primary portion of the building would be. The secondary materials, these could be the sort of accent materials on the building. So you could have any of those initial primary materials. And they could be up to a third of the facade, or use some other types of materials, perhaps a bit more contemporary in type. So like the fiber cement siding that's available, metal sidings, concrete, are listed as potential secondary materials. And then there is a list of materials that are prohibited, including vinyl and plastic, smooth-faced concrete block, plywood, particle board, MDF type board, from a longevity point of view primarily there. Stucco and the exterior insulation and finish systems, which I have a vague sense of what those are, but I think that's the things you put up in spray over the top of them. Your fast food type buildings often constructed that way. So that's our approach, is to sort of say these are the things that we want to see, these are the things we don't want to see. And so we've got some examples, and there's more examples out here on the table, so you'll have some photos to respond to and think about and see what you think looks like interesting, good material combinations or use of materials that would be appropriate in Shelburne. And then, these are some examples. Our little consultant team has had some conversations, and with the Planning Commission also around the idea of, there is certainly more contemporary type buildings. This redo probably been here in Heinsberg to the public house. Just sort of a very basic little industrial building that they redid to the restaurant. Uses metal exterior siding, but certainly has a design flair going for it. Some combination of metal siding and the wood materials on the outside. This building, for those of you who journey down to Manchester from time to time, is their new library. It's a rather lovely building, in my opinion, just because it's gray, my favorite color. And it's a beautiful gray-blue. But it's a combination. It's got wood siding, and it's also got pieces that are just your corrugated metal siding. Lee is smiling because he feels ownership of Manchester back there. So, a combination of sort of the very traditional approach with a more contemporary one. It's kind of an interesting building. This building is not showing up very well, but I end up driving by this one quite a bit. It's a building in downtown White River Junction that has been redone with the fiber cement panels. It's sort of in big block bits, and so it's the lights in here, we can't really see it, but there are brightly colored red and orange and such squares amongst the sort of neutral tone that most of the building is. So these are examples of metal siding too used in buildings. So one option that we are mulling over, and we haven't really written anything about, but have started to think about, we have this list of what you can do and you can't do, but is there enough flexibility for innovation and design within that? And one option might be to say, this is what you can and can't do, but if you want to come up with a proposal to do something that would violate these list of rules, if we go through the design review process, maybe we can be flexible about those material types. So that's something we're looking for feedback on from folks tonight, how they feel about having a list of actual materials. There's some language in there in the text about color as well, to try to limit the color palette to, I think, 3 colors as well, some things like that. So there's a little bit of design characteristics in there. So we'll be talking about that. I'm trying to think. I think that's the last slide. So what we're going to do, because we're a fairly small group tonight, is we've got 2 tables in the back, and if people would just split themselves up amongst the 2 tables, and we'll work on the various issues that we've just laid out and look at them in a little more detail. We'll spend, let's see, we're about 8 o'clock now. We'll spend maybe 30 minutes or so doing that, and then we'll come back here as a group and sort of talk through our discussion and what we've come up with at that point. Okay? Okay.
Can you say which are the topics on one table and which are the topics on another?
You just sit down at the table.
Oh, I see.
I can tell you. When I get back there and I see it, but I don't actually remember.
We want to see if anybody has any comments at this point in the audience.
Prior to sitting down?
I don't know if somebody might have brought a story with them.
Broken apart.
So just, see, we've lost a few, but we've got some people who've hung through to
Yes.
the end. Oh, we need to talk until night.
Are we on?
We're live.
We are.
We can hear you.
Okay. So I did just want to give us a few minutes to wrap up and sort of have final thoughts, see what each group spent their time talking about. So why don't we hear from the group that I wasn't in, because I'm tired of listening to the one I was in already, right? So I want to hear what the other one was talking about regarding the stormwater and the
Right.
parallel road. And then what did we hear?
All right. So on the stormwater side, we heard some really interesting ideas about trying to incentivize how we could encourage neighbors in particular to pool their stormwater treatment capacity in a way if they had the soils and site conditions to make that a possibility. We talked a little bit about specific areas where there might be opportunities, particularly at the north end of the district and at the south end over by the salt shed where there's a lot of apparently really well-suited soils. If there were a way to direct water actually to those areas, which could be a challenge, but we talked about ways that we might do that. There were some interesting ideas about the balance between building heights and overall building footprints, whether there could be some flexibility if you had some limited opportunity to sink water into the ground to maybe keep your square footage of your building the same, but make it taller instead of spreading it out and taking up more space. Thinking about up instead of out within limits. We don't necessarily want skyscrapers, but if there were ways to encourage compact building footprints as a way of reducing our overall impervious coverage, that might be a good strategy. There was a suggestion to include the map that we were discussing potentially in the code to highlight for applicants areas where the soils might be particularly well suited to green infrastructure that can actually infiltrate. I think those were the big interesting ideas that came out in that discussion. There was a lot of good discussion about the parallel roads. Nobody likes the south parallel road. This is still true. This is still true. But there was actually a really good discussion about what the objective of those parallel roads really is, and the idea of promoting connectivity between those neighborhoods in the back of the Route 7 corridor. Maybe the parallel road isn't necessarily the best idea, but it came from a place of wanting to try to encourage interconnectivity and mobility of people without having to go all the way out to Route 7 and come back. Nobody wants the road in their front yard, which I can appreciate. There are some challenges about that, and we definitely discussed them. But really, connectivity is the goal, and maybe a bigger discussion even outside of the form-based district about what people really desire about connectivity between those neighborhoods and potentially even other places in town might be a good next step. Let's see. What else do I want to say? There was a little bit of discussion about how maybe a parallel road on the west side of Route 7 might make more sense than a parallel road on the east side, particularly maybe from about, what did I say? Yeah, that sort of central to almost south part of the town, depending on what your goals are for that connectivity. At the north end, again, that parallel street is a little tough, but the big cool idea that came out of that is maybe it's just a rec path. If the idea is really people People were interested during the original form-based overlay district discussions about getting street to street back there and getting their kids street to street back there without having to go out to Route 7. And maybe the answer to that is a rec path rather than a road. Maybe that actually fulfills the need, and it has a lower impact in terms of the width of the impervious, and also on the potential impact to the buffers along the back of that first row of buildings, the big commercial buildings right along Route 7.
You got it all.
I think those were the big things.
Nice recap.
So the group that was looking at the building heights and building materials spent a fair amount of time just sort of talking about the fundamental underpinnings of the form-based code, the basic idea of trying to increase density and development in this area of town, and the desirability of doing that. So some of the basic issues. We did talk a little bit about diversity. People don't want to see all the same thing, whether it was all same building heights or all same building materials or all same building styles. Some diversity there. We were just getting into a bit of discussion about the second floors. There seemed to be some sense that if you were going to require a second floor, it should be functional space. It may not be occupied today, but it could be occupied again in the future. But there is still the issue of that there are some uses. The Trader Joe's is probably a pretty good example of that, of a type of use that might be desirable that just probably wouldn't fit into a building with 2 floors very easily or smoothly. But then again, there are other places along the corridor where it isn't saying, we're saying that they have to be 2 stories everywhere. So some flexibility. And I think we were also thinking about the flexibility around the materials as well. I don't know, Dean, did you have anything you wanted to throw in from that discussion?
What was the reaction to the "you can't use these" list on the materials? Do people like that idea
We didn't
of trying
hear
to
anything
articulate a
about
list?
that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Andrew?
Well, I was just curious why vinyl is out, given that it's so practical in Vermont.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
We struggled with this when we went through the first
Mhm.
iteration of the code on how do you start to pull a list together. Everybody has a different aesthetic view, and cost issues come into play, and which is why we have our experts trying to figure out a path that might work
Yeah.
for us. But there was somewhat strongish community reaction to trying to develop a list, whether a preferred list or a prohibited list seems to.
I live in a vinyl-sided house that I didn't love when I bought it, but it's incredibly functional and practical. So,
Right.
and it looks sort of it has the New England aesthetic, right? I mean, the concrete shingles would do the same thing, but from a distance, you'd have to look pretty carefully to know if something's vinyl versus
Mhm.
concrete shingle, you know. I was just curious.
I think that
Yeah, that's why I asked.
oftentimes these material lists, they have a couple of things going. They've got aesthetics, and they've also got longevity and durability going with them. So I think that's one of the issues at play there. You know, there is also some sense of historic materials being preferred over more recent materials. Some of that's just like because we know what the old materials are and we like them, probably, you know, or that this kind of thing has come out of historic preservation in many ways as well. So it's an interesting question, and I think, you know, we've put together some initial materials for you, but I have a feeling it's an area that when you start moving it forward, you're going to get much more feedback on.
Yeah, we hope so.
And see what people do think. I mean, if you were to go through those building examples that I put out there in more detail, I think you could find buildings that you would like that would include the prohibited materials, and you would find buildings you don't like that were made out of the preferred primary materials as well. So it's not just the materials, right? There's a lot of else goes into the question of whether it's a building that you're going to find appropriate or aesthetically pleasing.
Great. So that takes us to next steps and timeline.
So we are going to continue to churn forward on revising this, and we hope to have a full revised section of overlay district within a month or so for you guys. to be looking at,
Okay.
with the goal of you getting to go through it one more time and with your fine tooth comb. You did it with the wide tooth comb last time. I
Right.
think you're gonna narrow it down and go through
Okay.
it a little more, and then we'll make revisions as needed from that point. But the goal is to really sort of be wrapped up with a solid draft that you're ready to move forward with by the end of the summer. So.
And how are you thinking you'll respond to input you received this evening, to the extent you
Well, I think
want to, or do you want it? I'm wondering how we take some of that input and reflect it in.
Well, I think we're going to be looking for you guys to also take this input and give us some policy
Okay.
direction back. I think the things we went over tonight are sort of the larger policy questions that are kind of facing us as we work on the code. We've got the technical pieces that before I said there were some of these other things that we're working on, but they're a little more technical. These are really sort of underlying core policy questions that you guys need to make a decision about in some ways.
Mhm.
So, do you want to regulate the materials or not? And if so, we can work on that list and things, but we need to sort of have that broad sense, this question of trying to clarify and make consistent the building heights and what your intent is around those. Those are a little bit more, and the parallel road one as well. If that is going to continue to be an issue
Got
that
it.
comes up, then this is the opportunity to fix the language to make it more functional.
So you don't want to decide the parallel streets for us?
Oh, Paul and I are happy to decide the parallel streets for you. Are you just going to take
no,
our
I-
decision?
I get it. Thank you.
I'll make policy choices for you. You
No,
just
no,
might
no.
not want to live in my world. I don't know.
That's helpful. Okay, that's great. So we'll expect a revised draft in about a month.
Mhm.
Give us a chance to look at it. End of
But
June,
I think the key thing
July.
is scheduling some time at the next meeting to make.
Yeah, debrief on. Okay.
Yep.
Well, thank you, everybody, for
you.
coming out for this. Appreciate your time, and glad we got some input from everybody. And thank you, Brandy and Amy, for leading us through this exercise. It was really good input, and we look forward to continuing our work on this topic. Okay, our next item on our agenda is an update on the comprehensive plan. So the lead into this is, I missed our last meeting, but we are in the process of updating our town plan. We have a plan update due in February of 2019. That will come much quicker than most people realize when you see that date on a calendar. So the exercise at the last meeting involved talking about how do we define a big idea, right? This visioning exercise around what are going to be our guiding big ideas for the next iteration of the comprehensive plan. And Dean, do you want to give a quick?
Well, I think one of the first things I would do is to just remind everybody about the materials that were included in the packet and the why they were included in the packet. And then I think we want to perhaps talk a little bit about the list and the organizing of that list that Jason did.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
That's what I thought. We'd turn it over to Jason to just talk through the spreadsheet and the list.
Yeah, and to do that, I really just had a question for everybody. This was sort of distilling, well, it was a list of all of the ideas, and then I loosely grouped them into broader categories, just to have that in mind. The idea was to use a collaborative spreadsheet online just to go through and rank so that we all see what that is, and then since there's a column to the right that would show what the average is across everybody's votes, just to give us an idea of where these ideas are prioritized. That was the concept behind the whole exercise. But the feedback that I would ask for is, does this seem helpful, or are these ideas on track with what you're thinking, or does this seem like, well, I'm not really sure what we're doing?
Yeah.
Because if there isn't value, then maybe we go in a different tack. The one thing that I found interesting is, as I was kind of loosely grouping these together, there were 5 categories that I came up with that, they're applicable and they're things that we do chat about. The town planning approach and the core fundamentals is sort of separate. The data didn't really represent the way I was expecting to see it, which was a point of interest on its own. And that's why I just ask for any thoughts, comments, or is this generating any concept that may take us in a direction away from what we already have? Not that we necessarily want to do that, because I know we went into this with the idea of a lot of change, but when I was looking at this and then going back through the, what's laid out in the vision statement and the goals and that sort of thing, we're not really far off track. There's not a huge earth-shattering thing that's coming out of this exercise, so I'm trying to figure out if that's what we're looking to do, how do we pursue that?
Sometimes these exercises confirm things that you've already done.
Right.
Which is good.
I had a kind of thought, which was, it was really good to see our old executive summary that didn't make it into the,
Yes.
yeah, anyway, to look at our vision statement and just to read through it. And I was surprised to find there were so many things that I found kind of unclear or wishy-washy, or I just didn't agree with anymore, looking at it again, which is a little bit, sort of surprising, to me at least. But it was there was a lot of good work that went into it, and many of the ideas just seemed to need a little bit of tweaking or refining, and I wanted to suggest that we just go back and we use this as a sort of jumping off point, and everybody maybe kind of has their own version of their reactions to this, and we just sort of talk about that. The idea of, I think, was it you, Anne, who talked about maybe not, or maybe it was Don, who talked about not sort of reinventing the wheel, don't make this any harder than we need to, and maybe going through the existing plan and just.
That might even have been Dick.
Yeah, that's what I remember from the VCAM.
It was somebody who
Dick
had
and
said
Don
that,
sort of
anyway.
suggesting, is this a worthwhile exercise,
Yeah.
or is it just confusing us?
Yeah, I just don't know if we have the sort of psychic energy to take on, collectively, this huge revisioning. And, the existing plan is not bad. It's there's certain things that I think could be more strongly emphasized, and it's a bit lengthy and it's redundant and things like that, but nothing that a good editing couldn't handle, and then maybe just some updating as needed.
Just thinking we could have Brandy take a look at this.
Well,
Well-
I mean, she'd have to be able to channel, what, I think what you're talking about, Kate, is still something that either, it means that in a session you talk it through, which is gonna be time consuming, or everybody goes home and they mark up the draft and they put pluses and minuses at different places, and then we can aggregate that, or if people wanna go beyond that and they wanna start editing, they could edit it and we could bring that together. But it means you either say, I don't have an opinion, or you say what your opinion is, and we compile it. And then
That's not a bad idea, because the old vision statement is basically 2 paragraphs. The following represent in no particular order from then on is not part of the vision statement, we'll call it. So in the one that was in 2012, basically, it's 2 paragraphs. So that's not a lot of editing for people to work on. Well, I'm with Kate, there were some nice phrases in the older version, and there is some good stuff in the newer version, and I would be surprised if this group of 7 couldn't take a stab at writing a 1 or a 2 paragraph vision statement, borrowing what they like best from the 2 versions, and just come up with something that the group could probably support.
I don't want to fall into any kind of semantic trap. When you said you liked the 2012 version, are you saying that with regard to the first 2 paragraphs?
Oh, well, I was just kind of reacting to what was here, including
But the entire
the
piece.
the list of
Yeah,
this,
that's,
that, and
and
the
so
other,
that's
sort
where
of
there's a
summary
difference
list.
between, I mean,
Yeah.
regardless of whether or not it's
she
strictly speaking
means
of
the
visions.
full list?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
yeah, so that's where I wanted to
Well,
be.
it's a good thing you asked.
Well, it was just a good kind of summary of the whole document. And
I
then
just
that's,
wasn't sure if you were saying the same thing.
yeah. So now the overall organization into the 2 volumes and all that, I mean, I think that we could really
I thought we've gone,
synthesize that very differently. I mean, we could,
are we not following Ferrisburg? I mean, I thought that question was answered, that we were not doing 2 volumes.
So did I.
okay.
I thought we were,
Condensing.
Condensing.
I was kind of thinking like, what's the easiest way to do this? And just
Okay, okay.
stick with the existing document, have a good thorough look at it, see if there's anything that needs to be updated, and then reorganize the whole thing, you know, so that it's not as cumbersome. So it might be a document that somebody would actually want to read and look at.
so,
And that could be in the Ferrisburg format, or just in some better version of what we already have. I just didn't want to go back to, like, let's just start from scratch. That's what I was trying to get away from, which seemed like a good idea, and then, until
Yeah, I
started all
don't know
thinking about
that
it.
starting from scratch has been really on the table for a while, but I just want to make sure that we have a common understanding of what the desired product is. And I'd been thinking Ferrisburg, because we were just telling the select board.
we did tell the select board Tuesday night that,
Yeah.
and that doesn't mean that we won't be
locked in.
influenced by the Ferrisburg plan. I think maybe to
We told
some
them to look
people,
at it.
it's more the aesthetic of that town plan that
Yeah.
some commissioners preferred more than a very dense kind of narrative type current town
Well,
plan that we have.
I don't
with-
think they're mutually exclusive. I mean, I think we can take what we have and then just funnel it into, but it doesn't seem to be, right now, it seems like we're doing is we're kind of, to me, it's sort of putting the cart before the horse. We're putting the substance of what we have into the Ferrisburg format, and I think we should review what we have first, make sure that it still makes sense, and then put it into, if it does, then put it into the Ferrisburg format.
Valid. I think the, part of the big idea exercise was to get a feel for where commissioners felt the priorities lied, so that as we get into revising our town plan to make it look more like Ferrisburg and to figure out what cuts and what gets cut and what stays, we can have that prioritization in mind to guide us. But the alternative could be to take what we have and go through it and highlight areas that, well, this seems really superfluous, we don't really need this, and then just have that discussion as we work on a reduction to get it into a slightly more manageable format.
Well, I was just thinking if we went through sort of an edit of what we have now, we could probably condense it and then have less stuff to have to put into the Ferrisburg format, rather than put this huge cumbersome thing translated into the Ferrisburg format, and then go through and have a look at, like, okay, does this, you know, it just seemed easier.
And group editing can be kind of a challenge. So I'm just wondering though, but you can break it down, and so I would be curious to know, do people have any thoughts or preferences on how you would want to manage that? You can give assignments to different areas, you'll have to deal with the stylistic differences, but everybody's working on different pieces, and then you bring it in and others react. You only have to work on one piece, but you're reacting to the rest of them and giving feedback. Or do you want to try to keep it consistent and have everybody going through everything?
The thing I liked about Jason's exercise here is he would use a 1 through 3, and 3 for the things that you didn't really care about or didn't like, and 1 is obviously your priorities. And if nothing else, we could get an idea of what our priorities are. If we, once we've added the things in here that we.
And
Or like you-
once we define priorities, what will that do?
Well, it'll give us something to put together.
Could weed out some of the things that.
Maybe, maybe it'll help.
Yeah.
But one of the features was if you had possible additions, because just, you did an exercise, you might have left the meeting thinking, oh, I wish I had said X. And so if there were any things, because the shortcoming of the list and prioritizing it is that if you feel like it's missing something, then you kind of leave it off the table.
Right.
And there's no shortage of grist for the mill. I mean, I was thinking that in addition to some of this stuff, there was some interesting stuff that came from SDAT. You know, I didn't give you guys that, but
Well, one of the things that's what I was thinking about. I mean, you know, a lot of discussion of the visual image of the town in the old, you know, the one that the select board threw out. And it just, and this was before we knew what we really meant by that, you know? Now we do. So, you know, again, you know, cue over to the SDAT report, and other things. So I just, it just seemed like there were a lot of things that really had a lot of merit in the previous process that we can just kind of run with and extrapolate on. Like now we know protect many more valuable resources. Well, now we know that these include tremendously important wildlife habitat, bobcat corridors. You know, I mean, just there's a lot of like good jumping off places in here.
And what's the single most useful way to apply that vision? Is it to just put it in at the front? Or is it to use the items to help you do the editing, cutting things down? How do you think it's going to have the biggest impact?
Well, I liked your idea of just, you know, everybody could be assigned a certain section, or probably like a couple sections, realistically, right? And then,
I'll start with one, because I don't want to.
So, can I ask a question, since I haven't lived through a bottom-up rewrite of a town plan? How have we done this in the past, and has it been effective, or are we trying to do something here that just has never been done?
Yeah,
And we're
well,
going to
the
struggle
time-
with trying to define big ideas when no town plans in Vermont really take that approach? Or
Well,
are we trying to
some of them
anchor
do.
in on tweaking the vision over the course of reviewing the plan? And maybe that's an idea, right? Like, we have this framework for vision, that some ideas from Kate, and this will help us, but as we start to tackle section by section with this at the forefront, is that how it's been done in the past?
No,
I'm
mean,
asking what,
Yeah, so in the 2000s, I would describe it as one that, it had a couple of features. The document benefited from other documents. There was the new open space plan, and there were some other things that we considered foundation documents that poured a lot of the information into the new town plan. There was also work with a consultant who was kind of a facilitated and a bit of a taskmaster, because he had a certain number of meetings that he could work with the commission, and it was essentially 3 parts. Your first meeting, you'd be introduced to something, and it was a limited discussion, and then you would also have a follow-up discussion that you talked the meeting before, and that was where the majority of the time was spent. And then at the end, you'd have a concluding discussion of the thing that you'd started. So it was really simplistic, but you had 3 levels of discussion: introductory, heavy lifting, polishing, and you just progressed section by section through the document.
and who did the heavy lifting, the consultant?
Mike Munson did
So
a
the
lot of that.
commission was reacting to his heavy lifting
Yep.
at a draft level?
And going to every meeting, you know, used to this idea, this was the approach, and you had to kind of get your ideas out in this initial discussion, so he knew which direction to take things in, and it marched along. It took a little bit longer than I think we had hoped, but it moved along, and it was structured in that way. So that's the mid-2000s era. And then 2011, 2012, it was really more revisiting what had been written before, updating tables and things in volume 2. And so it wasn't really dramatic. It was.
Yeah, I was there for the
you
back
kinda
end of
knew the
that.
things.
I was there for the back
Trying
end
to
of
make
that
the
one.
language more relative to the other regs in town too. We tried to.
Yeah, so the difference, you know, between now and then was there's this sense that the current format isn't what you want, and you are going to take the material or some part of it and pour it into a new container. And so that-
Was that person a town volunteer who did that, or was that a paid
Mike,
consultant?
no, Mike was like Brandy. Mike is
Yeah, so
retired
we don't
now.
have
But-
that.
And,
He was a
and,
planner, I think, wasn't he?
yeah,
Yep.
and we still haven't, do we have a definite yes or no on whether there's a budget to hire
We talked
someone
about that Tuesday
pushes
night. That
you
was a
know,
conversation we
disciplinarian
had
who
on whether there
pushes us?
might be consultant funds. My reaction was if there is an opportunity, it would be limited and it would be more polishing.
Yeah, with the amount
More
of
on
money
the
that's in the budget,
graphical side of
unless we
it.
got a grant, and the grant funds wouldn't really be in our hands until next January, so it would give them limited
Very little time,
So the
Yeah,
answer is basically
likely
no,
no.
maybe polishing, but not
maybe. Some
disciplining us.
polishing, but definitely not the heavy lifting of, yeah.
So, which is why, let's make it as easy as possible for ourselves.
I
mean,
tend to
that's
agree with
what
you
I
on
think.
not having, I have some reservations about the bottom up, let's redraft this entire document based on a new vision. A new vision that's being developed by 7 residents of the town. That
I don't know
That idea, I might like that idea if we were very active in helping develop that vision within the community and we had a lot of time to actually help develop that vision. With 7 of us defining that vision, I get a little bit concerned about.
Yeah,
I
I
think-
guess,
Is that the right
I think you could come
idea?
up with a statement of a vision and not have this laundry list. The laundry list is really policies that are gonna lead the sections. There's a policy about energy, there's a policy about economic opportunities, there's one about safe transportation, one about roads, et cetera. So these things don't all have to be in a vision statement.
Maybe we
But
don't have
they
to
are
do it.
ways of implementing the vision. So they're gonna appear later, which means we're back to, you could still have like a 1 or 2 paragraph vision statement. And without having whole big public meetings, which of course isn't ideal, but we're short on time already. If the 7 people were to come up with their own, 2 paragraphs, you could discuss it at a meeting and say, I like this, I like that, I don't like this, I don't like that. And then you could put it out to the public in the newspaper and on the Front Porch Forum. Then you could get some feedback. If, for instance, this phrase, and the effort to maintain a moderate tax rate, that's in the old one. What if somebody puts it into the new one? And then people say, oh, no, that's not a big priority for this town, to maintain a moderate tax rate, and what is moderate? So, there could be some feedback on something like that. Whether you want a compact, walkable center, that's generally in all of the vision statements. If there's no reaction against that, it means, yes, the public likes a compact, walkable center where there's more dense development around the center. I don't think it has to be that difficult. I should shut up because I'm not going to.
No, you're,
Just show up and
okay,
do
final
this.
shot.
right.
I mean, I think one aspect of that old vision is it's really like an executive summary. I'm not sure that it wasn't written until after
Well,
everything
that's what I was
else.
trying to get
think
at,
it
is
was.
does it
So-
have to be
It was, yeah.
figured out right now, or can we just get into some of the work and
Yeah.
start editing and start
Yeah.
revising section by section with this as a framework of this seems like some important ideas that we should keep in mind as we go through that exercise of editing and updating? And we'll probably add to this list, honestly. I think there are some ideas that'll probably come up.
This could be our sort of like lens that we look at everything through. And,
Well, and this structure could apply to anything. We could take all these bullet points or all these goals and put them in there and have people score them and decide, if there's something that gets all 3s across the board from everybody, that's not a priority. That's kind of the idea behind this. There's no pride of ownership or anything. It's just more just trying to provide a framework that would help us with the task we have in front of us. And I'm a little concerned, mate. I'm very curious what the mechanics of the process look like, because we either take a section at a time where everybody goes and works on it and comes back, and then we spend an hour in a meeting just discussing that section, and then the person, whoever did the edits on it, goes back and reincorporates it? Or we just need to have a big retreat kind of thing and just nail down some serious framework so that then we can start diving into the detail? I'm a little worried that we'll keep scratching the surface a little bit more each meeting, but we're not actually going to get into it.
Can't talk about talking all the time.
Right. And I can't, I'm just having a hard time just figuring out how to make that happen. This was an attempt at that, but I'm completely open to ideas.
I mean, my reading of the situation a few meetings ago was that you had expressed really an affinity for the Ferrisburg format, and I had tried to show that, yep, you can take that Ferrisburg format, compare it to our existing format, draw all these lines, and see how you could pull material from part of the existing plan and put it into a Ferrisburg template. And in the process of doing that, and I was thinking that you would have, people would be responsible for different areas, or they'd be responsible and they would have my support in doing it, but they would pull it in and you would see a document emerge and you would talk about each person's work. So you'd be, starting at the beginning, and so whoever had that, land use section was gonna be working the hardest, at least initially. And we pull that land use stuff, but they're not creating a lot of new material. They're looking at the existing material and making judgments about, do we need this or can it go? Do we need it? Can we go? And they're going to take an initial pass, and the rest of the folks are going to say, well, you took out my favorite parts, or no, that looks good, or, it's got to be even shorter. That's what I had in mind, based on what people were saying before. That was the point of that whole string chart.
I like that.
Yeah, I mean, that seems like a workable way to do it, right?
Yeah.
I don't want everybody to get too hung up on this Ferrisburg format either. I think we talked a lot about it. I don't know how much time everybody has spent in that plan. I think it looks slick and it's a nice visual presentation, but the structure of it, I think, should be more of a guide versus
Something, and right, and
written in
that,
stone. We need to track Ferrisburg's format exactly. It doesn't,
So what did you tell the select board, that you would be inspired by
pretty much. We
Then
said we're
that's
using the
enough.
Ferrisburg
but
format.
there's
and-
no obligation.
No, yeah, I mean, it was more awareness. Here's an example of what we're using as
They're not
a
gonna
guiding light.
Oh,
No,
I don't think they will.
No, they're not gonna care.
no.
And another consideration is I think our final product isn't going to look like that because we wouldn't necessarily be using the same tool to
Right. Yeah.
create that
Right.
look.
I think your suggestion is a good one, to take that document you pulled together on this
Yeah,
tracks
and
to
I-
there, and then we can just start section by section. Use this as a guide, we can supplement this, we can change it, we can do whatever we need to do to use this as our guiding vision. And maybe at some point in that process, you really start to solidify
Yeah.
this vision.
Yeah, I mean, what I see happening is that it's, I'm gonna, between now and the next meeting, get as much of the material that I can organize in a way that I think is along the lines of what you're looking for, and you'll react to it. And we'll do a kind of a crazy version of what I was describing with Mike Munson, is that the first time we do this, it's gonna be initial for everything, but that the next time, you'll give me some reaction to the stuff and then have an initial discussion about the later section, because at least you'll keep moving.
Yeah,
Otherwise, you'll
No.
keep spinning in the same section. Don't want to do
that's
that.
what I'm worried about. And I guess I would ask if anybody feels strongly about certain sections of the plan, then let us know, so that as we think about, everybody's going to need to take the laboring oar on some of this, so if you feel strongly about energy, then just give us a heads up and say, I'd be interested
Yeah.
in taking the lead on the energy section.
And it's good that you mention energy, because we have that kind of special status that
Yes,
energy, if we're going to try to have our plan give the town the elevated say in the 248 process, and that means working with Melanie.
exactly.
And so that energy, if somebody really, really wants to deal with energy, I'd be saying we have to plug you into
Right.
that.
What is the last date of an amendment? Is there any amendment since
The last amendment to the town plan was actually in 2016 when we made the solar tweak,
Solar
right?
siting?
Solar.
I think
Yeah.
that was it.
Was there
This
any-
is the zoning regs. I don't have the plan on me right here.
I'm just wondering how good my plan is, that I don't think I've looked at
Get
It's
it.
you one.
online.
I mean, I can grab copies for anybody that
Yeah.
doesn't have one.
Okay, well that, is everybody comfortable with that approach? Okay. Great. We'll move on to our next item, which is an update on zoning issues. This is for the public
This is
hearing.
just to give people the heads up that your agenda will have the public hearing at the beginning next time, and the 3 topics that were warned are the ones that you set for public hearing. Doesn't mean
Daycare,
integrated agriculture, the.
daycare limit,
Sorry?
the daycare limit.
Daycare limit and the market on Shelburne Falls.
Okay, good. Great. Next item is commissioner questions and comments. I wanted to make actually 2 things. I mentioned the select board meeting. We had our report out for our CBC night. It went very well, in my opinion. I think it was well received. Thank you, everybody, for the input, and
I liked it.
the select board seemed happy
liked it.
with how things are tracking with our commission, so all the accolades go to you who are sitting here and all the volunteer time you put in, so thank you. The second item I wanted to mention is an announcement. Ann Hogan will be retiring sometime in June, and I wanted to personally thank you on behalf of the town and the commission for your 5 years of service, and we are going to miss your knowledge and wisdom greatly.
Thank
And
you.
camaraderie, and I just thank you on behalf of the commission and wish you a very happy retirement from town service for the time
Okay.
being, although you won't be far, so,
No, I'll be nearby, and I'd still like to serve the town in different
Absolutely.
capacities, and I have a project that's unfinished, which is to work with Pam Brangan on the business map. We haven't
Excellent.
updated it in well over a year. But I just want to thank you all for being such fine colleagues, and it's been a great learning experience, and I've enjoyed every minute of it. Thank you.
thank you.
Sometime in June is a little ambiguous.
This is
I
my
think-
last night.
Is this your last
Yes.
This
evening?
is your last meeting?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah,
I didn't,
We-
okay.
okay.
well, thank you. We will plan accordingly.
And if I'm supposed to
This
put
is your
that
last
in
meeting,
writing,
so, okay.
If this is your last meeting, then.
it is my last meeting.
Well, thank you.
Okay.
Farewell.
So-
Yeah.
That's what we will say.
All
and
right.
We look forward to working with you in other capacities,
All
too.
right.
I'll share with you that economic development is something we will tap into you for in the near future, so thank you again. Next, any other questions, comments from commissioners? Anything of note? Okay, we'll move on to our last item, which is other business. Dean, anything?
I just need to get to that section, if I did it or not. I'm not remembering from, I don't recall that there was any. I don't believe I have.
Okay. With that, we will consider a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Moved by Ann,
Second.
seconded by Jason. All in favor?
Aye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.